Okay, great. Let's get started. Hi everyone. Welcome to today's conversation on managing downside risks and upside gains of building performance standards. I'm Audrey. I'm an account director with Evora Global, located in New York. For those not familiar, Evora is a sustainability consulting and software firm. We focus on helping real estate investors, owners, and managers mitigate sustainability risks, enhance asset value, and safeguard investments by embedding sustainability throughout the investment lifecycle. Today, we're focused on building performance standards, or BPS, as we will probably refer to them throughout the conversation. Quick overview, these are policies across the US, enacted at the state level or city level, um, which require buildings to meet certain energy or carbon performance levels by a set date. Perhaps one of the most well-known policy right now is New York City's Local Law 97. BPSs evaluate compliance based on measured actual performance and compare performance to asset type specific targets. So they apply to whole building performance of existing buildings only. Several of these policies increase in stringency over time and impose financial penalties for non-compliance. So why are we talking about BPS today? They are influencing capital planning cycles, underwriting assumptions, leasing strategy, asset valuation, and long-term portfolio positioning. For many owners and investors, the next few years will determine whether their assets remain competitive or fall slightly behind. And to put this in context, for Local Law 97, it is estimated that the aggregate financial penalties could exceed 900 million US dollars in 2030. So today we're fortunate to have a great panel of three experts whose distinct perspectives kind of span ownership, policy, and advisory, and will surely generate an informative and insightful conversation. So I'll do a quick round of introductions of our panelists. We have Jonathan Flaherty, Global Head of Sustainability at Tishman Speyer, Cliff Majercik, Senior Advisor at the Institute of Market Transformation, and Ed Gabatas, Co-founder and Regional Manager of North America at Evora Global. Today, we're going to focus on three themes. The first being the current policy landscape and projected trajectory. The second will be strategy, so how owners and advisors are really integrating BPS into capital allocation and portfolio management decisions. And third will be potential structural changes impacting the feasibility of ongoing performance. So we hope you leave today's session with a greater understanding of the BPS landscape, insight into how owners are executing decision-making across their portfolio, and perspectives on the many complexities and challenges that these policies bring. So we'll save time for Q&A at the end. There's a box down at the bottom where you can just type in your questions and we'll get to them at the very end. So please feel free to provide, any questions for our panelists. And with that, let's dive into our session. So first question, how are building performance standard frameworks defining performance? So carbon caps, energy use intensity, a hybrid model, and which approach does the market want or need? And Cliff, maybe I'll come to you first for the first bit, and then Ed, you can jump in on the latter half of that question.
Thank you, Audrey. So there are currently 16 building performance standards around the United States that have been adopted at the state and local level. You have four states, Washington State, Colorado, Maryland, and Oregon, that have building performance standards. And then you have some of the biggest cities in the country, as you mentioned, Audrey. New York City, Boston, Washington, D.C., Denver, Seattle have building performance standards. And it's a mix. The states all have building performance standards based on site energy use intensity. And also some of the localities have building performance standards based on site energy intensity, energy use intensity, EUI. And then you have some localities, most notably New York City and Boston, that use greenhouse gas emissions as their performance metric, including the emissions from electricity. And now And then there are a couple that are a little bit more complicated that rely on like Energy Star scores. And I think that the expectation is that there may be a trend away from that. You haven't seen any adoptions like that in several years. And in fact, in Washington, D.C., which is one of them, they're talking about moving away from using Energy Star scores per se. All of them, though, are built on the Energy Star Portfolio Manager platform. So that provides some standardization, I think an important level of standardization. And many of them, and certainly this is something that we recommend, use Energy Star property types. So they set different targets based on Energy Star property types. And New York City actually started off with different property types, and then based on feedback from building owners and others, they switched to Energy Star property types. They generally have requirements that sort of ratchet up about every 5 years. And we think that makes sense in the context of capital plans that most building owners are planning out at least 5 years in advance. But we don't, we're concerned that if you only know what is expected 5 years out, it's hard to do long-term planning. If you're talking about, say, putting in a heat pump or putting in new windows, those are going to have long lives, 30 plus years in some cases. And you'd like to have that kind of visibility as to how the building is going to have to perform over that period. So, I mean, that's something that we think that market wants, is sort of long-term certainty. There is also a growing number of jurisdictions that are using both site EUI and on-site greenhouse gas emissions as two different metrics that every building has to meet. And that's every building has to do both, and the on-site and district thermal greenhouse gas emissions excludes electricity. So the idea is that if you aren't using any fossil fuels, not building any fossil fuels in your building, you have zero on that metric, so you're automatically good. We see a few different jurisdictions moving that direction. That's something that we recommend to both drive decarbonization of buildings and to drive energy efficiency. What we don't want to see is buildings, installing electric resistance that would be very costly to operate, that may be passed through to tenants, and it would also strain the electric grid. So this is all in the context of data centers and onshoring of manufacturing and things like that. Potentially, we're seeing electric prices rising very quickly in a lot of places. We're seeing electric demand rising quickly now after many years of being flat. And so building performance standards need to operate in that environment. They need to be helping to strengthen grid reliability. And big picture, we think there's even an opportunity where hyperscalers and others that really want lots of power could end up paying building owners to use less power and shift their power. And so that's a big opportunity. And I think that could factor into building performance standards.
So I jump in on that second part, Audrey. I think you asked, what the market wants, and Cliff, answered that for me. Long-term certainty. Do they want legislation? Flippant answer, probably not. But there's pros and cons of the different approaches that are being taken in terms of how the different metrics and targets are affecting operation. I can talk through some of the practical pros and cons there. I'm sure JP's got lots of pros and cons around how things are administered, probably more cons than pros. But you think about the energy use intensity mentioned in DC. That's going to have a very specific way that you think about meeting these requirements. Energy efficiency has been around forever. It's very easy to understand. Energy efficiency, it always wins. It's a more traditional route to making improvements, and particularly these impacts that we heard around the rate that costs are increasing. Clearly that's going to be a benefit for tenants, for NOI, focusing on reductions that pay back there. But the flip side is, energy is not specifically carbon. So it's not going to call out specific removal of fossil fuels, not necessarily a terrible thing in its own right, if we heard about the energy costs. But in many instances, replacing an old gas boiler with a new gas boiler is going to use less energy, but it's not necessarily going to move the needle as much on carbon as it would do for implementing a heat pump. Carbon, on the flip side, you mentioned Local Law 97, clearly there is a direct relation to emissions. So that is going to help when you're thinking about engaging with corporates, investors who have more targets and are more aware around how they want to decarbonize their assets and their investments over the time. But this is a long journey. If you do move to something like electrification, of course, there's a huge reliance on the grid to move at the same time, unless you're acquiring renewable energy. So that's something that needs to be considered through, both at the city and state level in terms of how they are supporting the movement to greener grids and therefore achieving the aims that we have here. Equally, the carbon thing, you mentioned there, I'd be interested to explore more with Cliff around electrification. That could lead to more OpEx, more costly operations, which is something that many people, particularly as we're seeing, are more conscious on the return of investment of some of these ESG initiatives. And it's interesting on carbon, a shift that we've seen in the last 12, 14 months or so, as the industry has retreated a lot around ambitious net zero targets. And there's obviously been a lot of changes at national level. We've seen the shift from carbon move from, if we can still talk about ESG, it's moved from the E bit into the G. It's really being seen as a compliance issue. And previously, a lot of folks were very ambitious around moving the needle on carbon and decarbonisation. It's increasingly being seen as a compliance issue, as a defensive issue, and not necessarily around the value creation that it once was, maybe sort of 5 years back. So, in terms of what the market wants, I guess it depends what you're aiming to do, who you're trying to please, what your drivers are. But ultimately you need to think about what's best for an asset and how that relates to the strategy that you're taking.
Great, thank you both. Cliff, you mentioned that these policies are expanding and growing in number or changing in the specific law. So as these policies evolve, should we expect to see more standardization or divergence at the local level in terms of the specifics of the law? And what are the pros and cons to each scenario?
Sure. Well, I mean, we're very much in favor of standardization, and that's a response to what we hear from building owners, especially big building owners like JP, who own buildings in many different jurisdictions that have building performance standards. It's hard to learn how to comply with just one building performance standard, and if it's no easier to learn how to comply with the second and third, you've lost a real opportunity to save people time. We want to have people spending as much time as possible making their buildings better and as little time as possible doing paperwork and that sort of thing. So standardization is helpful. Also, most policymakers don't really understand real estate very well. And so if they're winging it, if they're coming up with it on their own, they're liable to come up with stuff that doesn't really work with in real estate realities. And so we're endeavoring to try to create standard packages that reflect real estate realities and that can be adopted hopefully wholesale so that you have a lot of standardization. Now, one piece, as I mentioned, of standardization is Energy Star and Energy Star Portfolio Manager, that all these jurisdictions rely on that as the reporting and compliance platform. Also, increasingly, jurisdictions are using the IMT model, Building Performance Standard law, as a starting point when they adopt building performance standards. And we're creating a new framework for alternative compliance pathways so that those buildings that can't comply in the regular way because of unusual circumstances would have a standard set of ways to comply that hopefully many different jurisdictions will adopt. And so that'll improve standardization even across those building performance standards that are already in place. That said, different people have different priorities and different stakeholders are pushing for different things. So inevitably, we're never going to get to the sort of one size fits all kind of building performance standard law. The only way to get there would be to have a national law. And that's not going to happen in this Congress or the next Congress. So in the meantime, I think what we're doing is counseling these governments. We work with governments around the country that have building performance standards. There's 16 that have them. There's also another 33 that are part of our National Building Performance Standard Coalition that are committed to adopting building performance standards, but haven't yet done so, in addition to the 16 who are also members. So standardization is very much the way to go. I think there's something to be the fact that different jurisdictions are doing different things does give us some object lessons and opportunities to learn, but that's inevitable. As long as you have different decision makers, you're going to have some different policies. I think it's helpful for everybody to be pushing in the direction of standardization to minimize that.
And I'll just say IMT, where Cliff has worked for a long time and has been driving this effort, has done a lot to try to get to a standardized world. And I would just add briefly that everybody doing different things is in a way cool. Like it's like a little R&D petri dish of everybody doing different things. The problem now is we haven't had the phase where the learnings have influenced outcomes, right? So we've had lots of different jurisdictions do different things, and some work better than others, but we haven't taken any of those and used that to like drive to the better outcome yet. So that's what I hope happens, is that as we look at different jurisdictions and see what has worked better, that we see changes in various some of the early adopter policies to reflect market realities. That piece hasn't dropped yet, but hopefully that'll come in the coming years.
And I would say that our PATH project, which I mentioned before, around alternative compliance, is trying to learn from lessons learned on the grounds to learn from past mistakes. And our model law also learned, we wrote it after the first few laws had been written, including Local Law 97, and we tried to incorporate lessons learned and avoid some of the mistakes that have been made with prior building performance standards.
Great. That all sounds very promising. Thank you both. So shifting our focus towards strategy and how owners are planning for compliance, how you are responding. Are owners planning for minimum compliance or future-proofing beyond current thresholds? And what are some of the typical factors determining that strategy?
I can jump in to start here, and I'm sure Ed can jump in as well. I mean, I guess what I would say is it very much depends, and really to Cliff's point earlier, about exactly what real estate you're talking about here, right? Like what are we looking at, and what kind of asset is it, and what's the long-term plan for that asset? Obviously, Tishman Speyer owns Rockefeller Center. We've got a 100-year hold period. We've got a very, very detailed plan on exactly how we're going to deal with Local Law 97. And in the case of an asset like Rockefeller Center, it works great because we're also going to spend money in the future on maintaining that asset and improving it. And as we do things like replace, chillers and other equipment that reaches the end of their useful life, we want to make sure that we have an opportunity to use that as a guide to where we should go, meaning thinking about fuel switching, thinking about overall efficiency. Those are all going to drive into that conversation. Not every asset is Rockefeller Center. And so it's going to depend upon, again, how long you're going to own it, what's the hold period, what's the plan, and also how far away you are from the targets, right? And what does that really look like? In addition, in New York, and this is a challenge in some other jurisdictions as well, right now we only know what the carbon coefficients are through 2034, which seems like a long time from now, but for the purposes of capital planning is not. And so, we have 8 years of known carbon coefficients followed by many, many years of unknown carbon coefficients. And those have a really big deal on how this all plays out. And, one of the challenges that a number of jurisdictions are facing is how do you set those carbon coefficients knowing or potentially not knowing where the grid is going to go in the future. And so, one of the challenges that will very much become apparent in the coming years in New York is that the carbon coefficient in the law has literally no reality at all to the actual carbon coefficient occurring on the grid. And so, you can use that as a lever to create outcomes. But at some point, I think personally that having the carbon coefficient of electricity in laws have no relation to what is actually occurring on the ground is probably not helping our cause from an overall sort of legitimacy and otherwise conversation. And so how you set that number really drives a huge amount of where we're going. And I appreciate, and don't get me wrong, the complexity of trying to do this because you're trying to gauge out how many large-scale capital projects the grid will integrate in over time. And obviously the New York State grid is importing and exporting electricity from various sources. And so the carbon coefficient is not an easy issue. But as it turns out, it is the issue because that's what's going to drive penalties in the future. So anyway, I say all of that to say, and Cliff made this point, what we really want is long-term certainty. Because if we're going to drive our capital planning around this sort of thing, we need to know what the plan is over many decades into the future. And that is not the case in many jurisdictions today. So certainly long-term planning is a big piece. How long you're going to own that asset, what kind of asset is it, is all very much relevant. And then thinking about what it really means to decarbonize, because in New York City, even if we go to 100% all electric building, the carbon coefficient of electricity today, the actual one, not the one that is in Local Law 97, is horrendous. New York City is on a good day, 97 to 99%, gas-fired electrons, or oil-fired electrons in Zone J in New York City. So at least at the moment, electrification does not equal a better carbon outcome. In fact, in many scenarios, electrification equals a worse carbon outcome. And so how is that going to play out in the future? Who's building all these windmills, and where are all the transmission lines coming, and how much of that is really going to happen and not, all ties into how you think about how this is going to play out. And so lastly, I would just add also that, the challenge is, and, I don't want to get myself in trouble here, but if there's going to be 1 million BPSs, we would love to have one, right? And back to the point about some sort of standardization, because right now the way this works is you just have many, many different ways to get there from here in these different jurisdictions. A simple example is between New York and Boston. Boston allows you to have VPPAs and to purchase energy offsite in a market-based mechanism. New York City does not allow that under the law. And so in New York City, there is no way to procure carbon-free energy under the law the way it is written today, no matter where you get it, unless it's on site. And on site is not a viable option in Manhattan. And so, there's a lot of challenges if you go down that road. Again, even if you have the most motivated owner around who's like, I would like to buy all green electrons right now. In New York City today, you can't do a VPPA. There is no source of green electrons. The only pathway is on-site renewables. And again, that is not a particularly viable pathway for a good chunk of New York City. So these are all different things that come into how we think about how to meet these laws, how we plan around them. What's the durability of the law? Do we think it will exist in 10 years? Will it actually be enforced, right? And these are all the types of questions that go into thinking about that. I will just close by saying, having said all of that, we share the desire and the commitment to address global warming, and that means addressing carbon. And so where carbon is being priced, and certainly Local Law 97 is viewed as a penalty, but ultimately that is not what it is. It is a carbon tax. And a carbon tax is certainly a mechanism that makes a lot of sense in a world that doesn't price carbon. And so a carbon tax, like both what New York and Boston brings to the table, is a very reasonable approach to global warming. We're less enamored about energy efficiency strategies around this because the reality is the price of electricity is in fact priced today at a market mechanism that we know what it is and we have some sense of where it's going. So we don't necessarily believe that you need further incentives for energy efficiency. Electricity already has a price and it's being charged today. Carbon, on the other hand, has no price, right? And so to be able to address carbon head on and to drive things like fuel switching and electrification, you likely need to make carbon have a price. And so certainly as we look at the landscape of these laws and see, what is the ones that make the most sense from a strategy standpoint to work around, ones that look like a carbon tax and sound like a carbon tax, and in fact are a carbon tax, are the most elegant solutions available to the problem.
I'm personally a fan of carbon taxes. I would point out that there's not much momentum for carbon taxes in the US now. And actually in DC, the Clean Energy DC Act of 2018, which established the building performance standard, it actually, they looked at doing a carbon fee and dividend, and building owners pushed back, and we ended up with the building performance standard as something of a compromise. The other thing is just long-term certainty is so important. And our view is that jurisdictions should take on the risk around decarbonization of the grid rather than leaving that as a risk for the building owners, so that building owners have long-term certainty. JP made a really good point about the uncertainty around the conversion factor from electricity from kilowatt hours into greenhouse gas emissions makes it hard for building owners to make long-term plans for investments, especially related to electrification. And we'd rather that the jurisdictions take on that risk and say, all right, we're going to give building owners a set of, they know exactly what's expected of them going out, 30 years, and we'll be on the hook, we, the jurisdiction, if we don't meet our climate goals. Effectively, jurisdictions then can gamble that the grid is going to decarbonize, which I think is a pretty good gamble, just given the economics of solar and wind right now being cheaper to build than any kind of fossil fuel. But we think we put a real premium on giving building owners certainty and trying to not have to have building owners do their own scenario modeling around how quickly is the grid going to decarbonize, which is one of the reasons why we suggest using site EUI and on-site greenhouse gas emissions and not factoring in electric greenhouse gas emissions into the evaluation of buildings.
And, part of the reason for that is, Cliff, because obviously the number of people who know any idea about what you or I just talked about is not a huge crowd. And so part of the challenge is, in a world where we're trying to make this a little bit easier for people to figure out, if you spend the whole time talking about carbon coefficients of electricity, you're probably already toast. And so I think, as we think about the way to approach this, that point is, I wish it would be a wonderful world if maybe more Americans were fluent on these sorts of topics, but that is not, in fact, where we find ourselves. And so spending a lot of time worrying about that is probably not moving the ball down the court.
And I think that's where, in terms of the question, how are funds and portfolios responding, what we see when we're providing advice from a very practical sense is, what am I responding to? So there's a lot of investigation into, what are the thresholds, what's the timeline, what are the deadlines, what are the metrics that you're trying to move here? And then equally, what's the upside? What's the downside? What are the potential penalties here? But what could you stand to gain from this? And you mentioned about, carbon coefficient and all these different KPIs and jargon that's coming out here. The point that we always make is to bring it back to the fundamentals, bring it back to the financials so that you can appraise a situation based on, is this going to protect my exit value? Is it going to potentially enhance value? But being really clear around how a certain action is going to impact NOI, the return on cash, IRR. What are the investors thinking about at the end of one hold period? But as you say, these ratchet up every 5 years. So really, you should be looking out, 5, 10, 15 years, because there's going to be implications around the next buyer and probably how the buyer's buyer is going to think about the actions that you do or don't take. And I think, the reality is there's probably, 3 buckets of how firms and companies are going to respond to this. There are those that will, and that tend to be the institutional sort of players, because whether they like it or not, the legislation is here and you need to face what's in front of you. There may be those that won't, because they've got their head in the sand and they just think it's all going to fizzle away, or they just sue the government and just pretend it's not there. But there's going to be a big swathe of buildings that can't, for whatever reason. It might not be able to get capital. It might be that the building is in a phase of its economic cycle where it just doesn't warrant the upgrade, or it just can't find the capital to do that. And that's something that I think needs to be considered in terms of the just transition, to make sure that everybody can move at a similar pace, because there could be this downward spiral of those that can't improve and just create a further bifurcation of the market in terms of quality. I know that may be beneficial in making the wider building base improved and more efficient, but we need to make sure that everyone can come along at the right times. But I think that in terms of how people are responding, seeing this as a structural shift and not just a short-term nuisance is the way to view it. And as we mentioned plenty of times today, long-term certainty is the key to that.
And look, the just transition, Ed, sorry, Cliff, just for one second, it's a tough issue, right? Because, in New York, the strategy was to basically give affordable housing a totally different pathway that didn't involve making any upgrades or electrification, right? And that economically was the right move because obviously there's limited funds to go into that sector to begin with. But at the end of the day, what it means is that all of those units of housing will not be electrified, right? And so, what's the societal balance between achieving that goal and also, the just transition is not an easy answer to any of those things. But unfortunately, the easiest pathway is to just exempt that sort of thing from those requirements, which again, economically is an elegant solution to the problem, but doesn't actually solve anything.
Yeah, we agree that to the extent that there are funds available, they should be targeted at helping affordable housing and other sort of community priority buildings to improve their performance so that they can benefit their residents and help the jurisdictions achieve their climate commitments. But just sort of returning to that theme of long term, we want policy design and programs and everything else to be moving towards getting building owners to take a long-term perspective. And of course, that means not putting in, say, a more efficient gas boiler when they have the opportunity to instead put in a heat pump. Gas boiler might help you, meet your building performance standard for the next cycle, but it won't help you for the cycle after that or after that. And similarly, tenants are really important, especially commercial tenants are really important. They drive a lot of the energy usage in the buildings, and you need to have leases that align your tenants with your incentives with your tenants' incentives, so that both of you come out ahead when the building performs better and complies with the building performance standard. So, we've helped create something called performance-based leases. You can Google that. Also, we have run a program called Green Lease Leaders that recognizes landlords and tenants that are signing these win-win leases where both come out ahead when the building performs better. And some of these leases are 10 years or longer. In that period, your jurisdiction could go from not having a building performance standard to having one, or you could have 2 cycles of ratchet up. So you really need to be thinking about future-proofing both of your equipment investments and your leases to make sure you're protecting yourself from not just building performance standards, but also increasing electric and gas prices and other kinds of response to the carbon crisis, to the climate crisis.
Thanks, Cliff. Yes, you bring up a great point in terms of tenant engagement and tenants playing such a critical role in achieving compliance. So I'd love to hear how exposed landlords are to compliance risk due to tenant behavior, and then what are some ways to manage this, and maybe some real-world examples from JP would be helpful.
Sure. I mean, look, in an average office building in the United States, tenants represent between 70 and 85% of the energy use in the building. So obviously, the remainder is the base building, and certainly the efficiency of the base building systems is not irrelevant to energy usage at the tenant side. Having said that, the vast majority of tenant energy use is independent of the building's landlord-based systems or the HVAC. And so, or at least the base building HVAC that we can control. And so tenants are driving a huge piece of that puzzle. You know, into challenging conversation to tell tenants that they shouldn't be able to use energy. That's not particularly helpful, given that that's an ingredient to being a successful business. And so I think, that's why when we discuss this with tenants, we make sure to make it clear that this is a tax, like many other things. And, we just have to figure out the best way to achieve that goal. The reality is for most tenants, their ability to change their energy profile in any material way is fairly limited. Most of the decisions that can drive real change in energy use in commercial interiors are made when the space itself was designed and then later built. The number of levers a tenant has to pull once they're in their space and have been in there for some time is fairly limited. It's mostly related to HVAC, and even then, the temperature is not you don't get to vote on what temperature you would like the office to be. It is going to be whatever the various folks have decided it is going to be. And so again, if you've all agreed that the temperature is going to be whatever it is, then what else do you have? You can turn lights off, you can pull down shades. There are some other strategies available, but not many. And so most of what drives the tenant energy profile is, decisions that were made when the original space was constructed. And therefore, it's a long way of saying that when we have that conversation with tenants, there isn't a ton they can do, and there isn't a ton we can do. And so except to be clear at the point of construction and design. There's a lot you can do at the beginning with a tenant to work through how they're going to build their space, how they're going to operate their space, and what are strategies around that. But that conversation really needs to happen before construction, and while that space is being designed. There, real decisions can be made to change outcomes. After that, the die is mostly cast in terms of having real opportunity to change outcomes on an energy consumption basis on a regular sort of office space. And so we certainly encourage tenants to do as much as they can to please, let us turn the AC off on Saturdays, and maybe everybody, we don't need it until 8 p.m. on the weekdays. And maybe we can, do sort of demand response type activities during the afternoons and very hot days. But, there isn't a lot left for tenants to do after that to significantly bend the curve. And so we're kind of stuck with what people have. And that just means that we have to address that in a reasonable way when the time comes to divvy up the penalties.
And that there are unfortunately some leases that require that building systems be run on weekends and things like that. And often those leases don't reflect at all the way the tenant is occupying the space anymore, especially after COVID. So that's a real opportunity to address when you're writing your lease or renegotiating your leases. Yeah.
I think on this, it's hard to know which approach is best for landlord or tenant or the policy overall. But coming from the UK, like we've seen different methods of BPS being introduced. So more aligned to the Energy Star rating, Energy Star with energy performance certificates, where that looks at the regulated load, that looks at the notional energy within a building. So very much to what JP was saying, this is what has been built in base build. It's more in the gift of the landlord to put in place and then be rewarded for buildings that have higher efficiency. In fact, there's legislation through MEES, which is restricting leasing for the most poorly performing assets. But still, the challenge there remains. There's a huge performance gap in what you design a building to be, and then how the tenant or potentially the landlord chooses to operate that. So if you have 24/7 operations, if you have 3 or 4 screens per desk, you're going to use a lot of energy. But at least that method gives more for the landlord to influence, how they are setting up the base build. And then, it's more on the tenant to think about how their operations are controlled from their end.
Great. Yeah, really interesting to hear the global perspective as well. So thank you, Ed. Okay, just mindful of time, I think we should shift to our final kind of topic area. So structural shifts, long-term change. We've been using the phrase long-term a lot today. So, that's good. There is a theme. So how durable does federal support for decarbonization feel right now? And can ambitious local BPS frameworks sustain momentum if federal support and policy does become less supportive?
I only got an if. That is, it's already happened. The federal government has largely gotten out of the business of decarbonization.
This is not one we need to speculate on, Cliff. This is one we can speak to.
I'm trying to remain apolitical.
I mean, in the U.S. context, obviously, if you're talking internationally, lots of other national governments are still do very much care about this and moving forward. But yeah, in the U.S., the Trump administration is moving as fast as it can away from anything that would reduce fossil fuel consumption. I would point out that the first building performance standards were adopted when Trump was president the first time, and 3 more building performance standards have been adopted since he was elected. So on the one hand, it's unfortunate that the prospect of federal support for building owners to decarbonize their buildings is greatly diminished. You're not going to see anything new good, I think, in the next couple of years at the federal level. But from sort of a grassroots voter perspective, and when Biden was president, I think a lot of people thought, oh, okay, things are moving in the right direction. We have a federal government that cares about climate change and is taking action. Nobody has that illusion today, and so as a consequence, voters are looking to their state and local governments to act on climate to sort of fill that gap, and we're seeing that. So you see I think fewer resources in many cases, but also greater political will to move forward on this. Now, also, of course, affordability is a big concern now. So, I think increasingly jurisdictions want to design building performance standards and take other steps that will both advance their climate commitments and potentially also improve affordability. And there is electricity is expensive. It's more expensive than the past. In some places, it's rising very quickly. And that in a perfect world, that would mean everybody would use less electricity. But there is a real split incentive problem. There are a lot of landlords that don't pay for the electricity. Their tenants are paying for it, especially in sort of a residential context. In some cases, selling, tenants paying more for electricity could actually be a profit driver for some landlords based on their leases. So for that reason, we want to make sure that we're addressing those split incentives, that everybody has an incentive both to decarbonize and to be energy efficient, to use less electricity.
And I would just add that, the other thing for those that don't entirely appreciate what role the federal government plays here is that the federal government actually plays a very limited role in the commercial real estate sector nationally, in the sense that real estate is regulated at the local level. And so, or at least how we build and operate buildings is regulated either by the state or the local jurisdiction that you're in. So the federal government sets voluntary standards, which certainly drive outcomes, but it is not necessarily the case that if the federal government because they don't directly regulate real estate in any material way. Obviously, they set things like taxes, but that's for every industry. The federal government's role here is actually somewhat or even more, I think for, again, folks that aren't exactly clear on real estate and where they're regulated, is fairly limited. And so we want a robust federal response to all of this that helps everybody, and it helps drive to standardization and lots of other good outcomes. But the immediate change at the federal government level in any of these policies is very indirect outcome to the actual policies themselves at the state and local level.
And I've got not a response necessarily about the federal government, just more, broadly around, think about where we were 10, 11 years ago or so, Paris Agreement, we had globally legally binding commitments to focus on carbon. Fast forward 10 years, but it's now the biggest con job ever. So 10 years going forward, who knows where we'll be, but it's more likely going to be more support for this. We're looking at the way that, the reporting side of things, California first, New York recently, is really dialing up how probably 20% of GDP in the US is now leading to think and report on carbon impacts, Scope 1, 2, 3, climate risk. That's happening across the globe. That's something that is taking note to global institutional investors. That momentum, I feel, is going to continue. So whatever's happening now is going to be very different in 5 years, in 10 years. So again, it's bringing it back to the fundamentals of what is the right strategy for a building, for a portfolio, and tying it back to the financials.
And those financial climate risk disclosure laws, like you have in California and the European Union, they apply globally to to companies that have operations in those jurisdictions. So even to buildings outside of those jurisdictions. And they actually, I think, are going to accelerate the impact of building performance standards, because building performance standard penalties represent a climate transition risk. So if they become material, they need to be disclosed. And I don't think any CFO or CEO wants to be disclosing that. So our expectation is that it's going to cause these building owners to want to move more quickly to get those potential liabilities down below material levels so they don't have to disclose them.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we'll do one final question and then we'll kind of switch our focus to Q&A. So I'll just do another plug. If anyone has any questions, please enter them into the Q&A box. So last question for our panelists. Does, and to what extent, if so, policy volatility, or I guess I'll reframe this, how are investors and lenders thinking about policy volatility, if they are, in terms of underwriting projects and capital allocation?
Well, I guess I would just say I don't know. They're going to have all the same questions that we're talking about in terms of long-term planning and whatever. I guess what I would say is the important point is that global warming isn't going away, it's getting worse, and that's obvious. And so, you know, institutional investors with long time frames are not unaware of that, and they are very aware of the fact that they need to incorporate that into how they plan for making investments and for delivering to their fiduciaries at the investor level. And so, there's lots of ways to go down that road, Audrey, in terms of that question. But I think the most fundamental answer is that nothing has, despite all of the discussion and talk, nothing has changed in the science. And we're on a rocket ship to 2.75 degrees. And if there's anything that's become certain, it's that. And so that's the reality we face. And so, I don't think that is lost on anybody that understands what's actually going on. And so, you can maybe this is a moment where many people it feels it appropriate to put their head in the sand, but it's getting toasty in that sand. So you better be prepared for that outcome and thinking long and hard about where this is all going.
Yeah, that's well said. And I would just say it's unfortunate that we having this sort of whipsaw between like federal administrations. I think it's clear that, as JP says, climate change is inevitable. It's accelerating. It's going to impact. It's already impacting all of our lives, and it will do so more in the future. There will be policy action against it, but we can do that in an orderly transition where we're taking into account real estate realities and all the stakeholders are at the table and we're trying to move early, or we can do it in a disorderly way where you have no predictability and the right stakeholders may not be involved in developing the policies. And I fear that if we don't, move proactively, we're going to, land on the second path, which is certainly isn't good for investments, isn't good for predictability, and so what we see is far-sighted building owners and others engaging on things like building performance standards, working with the jurisdiction, saying, let's have an orderly transition. Let's not put our head in the sand and then have some sort of a reactionary, quick decision. The other thing is I see lenders are ultimately, if you're a mortgage lender, you're ultimately on the hook for penalties from building performance standards. If you have to take title to that building, you're the one who's going to be on the hook. And so lenders are agonizing around this. On the one hand, they know it's a liability. They know they should really be factoring it heavily into their underwriting. On the other hand, no one wants to be the first to do that, and then their competitors start picking up deals that they're walking away from. And so I think it's moving slowly now, but at some point it may start moving very quickly.
I think from what we see, your question about how are folks approaching sort of underwriting and assessing this acquisitions, I think this is where we need to be really thankful of organizations like IMT, for I imagine everyone on this call, because the reality is that where you do have BPS, it is being considered and it's far more likely to be underwritten with action plans put in place and financing agreed. I asked at a conference recently, would you be doing anything on decarbonisation without BPS? And the answer sadly was no. So, you do need these six, as well as the carrots that we see from the corporate world in terms of occupiers and certain investors. But the reality is, are you incorporating this into acquisition? Yes, you're at least considering penalties, and then ideally what actions you can improve where you have these programs in place.
Perfect. Great. Well, thank you for those kind of final three perspectives from my questions, at least. We do have a few questions that have come through in the chat. This is a long one to start out with, so bear with me as I read it out. But so performance-based leases were mentioned by Cliff to align incentive. In practice, how enforceable is the pass-through of BPS-related penalties or compliance costs under both typical multi-let lease structures and triple net leases? And are we seeing pushback from tenants, given that they are usually limited under typical leases, I think, as JP mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on how the law was drafted and what exactly is the mechanism that the fines or taxes are applied, So, for example, in New York City, the law was done as the basis of fines as part of the Department of Buildings. And so and the irony of that was that that was done solely based on the fact that that is the only mechanism that New York City has to impose that without getting the state of New York to do it on their behalf. And the state of New York was not willing to do it on their behalf. And so the only mechanism they have is to do this through the Department of Buildings as part of a buildings-based approach. And the Department of Buildings is not allowed to tax. And so the only way to do it is to do it as a fine. It happens that the way that multi-let leases are written in New York and in general in these sorts of markets says that if you get a fine from DOB, the assumption is that you did something wrong, right? Historically, fines from DOB meant that you had some sort of health or safety issue with the building. And so fines are not allowed to be passed on to tenants. And so therefore, in most leases in New York City, the fines from DOB related to Local Law 97, despite the fact that they are not, in fact, a health and safety issue of that, it's just not how the leases were envisioned. And so, as a matter of course, most leases do not allow those fines to be passed on. There are other jurisdictions where it is not a fine, it is a straight tax. And in that case, taxes are allowed to be passed on through multi-let leases like that, and tax increases can be added to the expense pool. So it's very much how each individual law was crafted and the mechanism by which they are doing it. And that is almost entirely based upon what sort of power that jurisdiction had to impose that to begin with. Again, it happens in the state of New York that only the state of New York can impose taxes, except for property taxes. And so therefore, New York City had no mechanism to do this but the fine route. Other jurisdictions have different ways of approaching it that don't all equal the same outcomes. So it very much depends. As for whether tenants are pushing back or not, I mean, I guess I would say tenants are aware of all of this, and sometimes we see pushback and sometimes we don't. It just depends upon the type of tenant and whether they're really actually paying attention and if they understand the true magnitude of what may or may not happen. But I would say it's a mix of folks that care and folks that don't care.
And we recommend that you not use the term fine or penalty when you're writing a building performance standard. We recommend use of a term like payment, alternative compliance payment, for the exact reason that JP just outlined, so that appropriately commercial tenants should have skin in the game so that they have an incentive to work with the owner to improve the building performance and comply with building performance standards. And leasing can address that. Even if your jurisdiction calls it a fine or penalty, you can write your leases such that tenants have to pay their fair share. That's just that the existing leases usually don't do that. And ideally, the tenant should be paying their fair share in proportion to how much energy they themselves are using. And your tenant should be separately or sub-metered.
All good points, Cliff. Thank you. This is on a related note. So for those jurisdictions that do have penalties or payments, such as, Local Law 97 and BERDA, which is Boston, what do those cities or jurisdictions do with the money that they receive from the penalties? And is there kind of a standard approach there, or is it, ad hoc?
Well, our recommendation is that the money should stay in the built environment and it should be used to help buildings improve their performance, targeting, again, community priority buildings like affordable housing first with that. There are jurisdictions like New York that by sort of state law or charter, I can't remember which, can't do that. They have to put it into the general fund. We don't think that's a best practice. We don't think that these should be viewed as a tax. We think they should be viewed as, we want buildings to succeed and we're not looking to raise more money from the general funds. But there are jurisdictions that can't do it that way, like New York City.
I'm going to pass on that one, Audrey.
Okay, I was pausing just in case anyone else wanted to add in. Great, this is a little bit more of a technical question, but do any policies envision electrification in 15 years? So I guess, do they build in those assumptions within the policy details?
I mean, several of the building performance standards are aiming at driving electrification, and more or less explicitly. And they have different requirements for different building types based on, each jurisdiction has a different requirement and, for each of their building types. But a lot of them are very explicitly trying to drive buildings to electrify. And one thing that we've seen, and I think JP shares this view, we think it may be in many cases easier to electrify district energy systems than building by building. So we don't want to see buildings defecting from district energy systems so that they can put in their own individual heat pumps. We'd rather see, not because of just personal preference. We think economically it's just going to be cheaper and easier to decarbonize a whole district energy system. The real estate where you're doing it is less valuable than the real estate in these buildings, especially buildings like Rockefeller Center that JP was talking about.
And look, we see this all over Europe. This is very common, right? This is a US unique that we have these sorts of questions. I mean, there's large scale district energy systems all over Europe, many of which, not all by any means, but many of which operate at very, very low carbon coefficients or zero. So there's a lot of good answers and good stuff there to go down that road. It's just not something that we've really explored much in the US at this point.
Great. Okay, final question. This is kind of jumping back to what we were just talking about, but so penalties for non-compliance, we touched upon the tenant, but do these penalties get distributed across the lender, asset owner, property management at all? If so, have any of you seen that?
Well, I mean, look, at the end of the day, the law is very clear. It's the owner of the building that owes the penalties, right? So how you choose to try to get that back from other people is a different story. But there's no confusion about who has to write the check. In terms of whether or not anybody else wants to pay that fee, or penalty or tax, whatever you'd like to call it. My personal experience here at Just Inspire is we're seeing very few takers raising their hands who'd like to share in that burden. I think that's probably not a newsflash, right? So, I don't foresee outcomes where that's going to change significantly in the future. I don't, see why the lender would feel any need to step in and do any of that. I think they're worried about the liability down the road for the equity side, but they're not themselves concerned enough to be writing any checks on their behalf. So I think the owner will remain the person who's responsible and then try to figure it out from there.
Yeah, I would just add to that we think that the stakes are high and that owners should be protecting themselves. And this is not going to be an overnight thing. This is hard. The industry has long traditions, and these traditions change slowly. But ultimately, we would like to see a situation where when you're procuring a new building, you're going to tell the designers of this building that you want to see this building perform at a level where you're not going to have to make any alternative compliance payments under the building performance standard. And they're going to be on the hook for that. And then ultimately, we think the designer is not going to want to be fully on the hook because it also depends on how the building is built and operated and maintained. So we think that potentially is driving towards design, build, operate, maintain contracts where you can more easily hold that one company accountable for actual performance.
Yep, that's interesting. Okay, well, I just want to thank our panelists so much for such an interesting, informative conversation. It's a complex topic that's evolving, but we really value these types of conversation as an industry and kind of continue to drive us all forward together. So thank you three, Ed, JP, and Cliff. Really great session, and thank you to our audience for tuning in.
Thank you.
You guys.
Okay, thanks all.
Bye all.